Welcome to the show. I still have as my guest this week, Ann O'Brien. We were talking about Margaret Haughery. Last week we did all about her early life leading up to St. Vincent's, but there's so much more. We had to do 2 shows on Margaret. So today we're going to pick up with her life. She has now established a infant asylum for young infants, and this is Margaret's dream. So St. Vincent's is still standing too.
That's right. That's right. And Margaret always called St. Vincent's her baby house because that orphanage was, or asylum, as they were known
then, yeah.
And asylum has taken on a totally different meaning, but in the 19th century it meant a refuge, which is a wonderful term. But, Margaret went in, took on this challenge with St. Vincent's, and they opened up and they had room for 200 orphans, and it was always full. And it was specially designed for, just newborns to, 4 or 5 years old. So, that was the purpose of that. And then after they reached that age, then they transferred over to the female orphan asylum, again, right around St. Teresa's where we are now. And then when they got to be about 12 years old, then they went to another orphanage, which was called St. Elizabeth's House of Industry. And that was built in 1855, the first one. And Margaret was also, a huge, huge benefactor of that orphanage and helped get that built.
And part of the reason for those is that, the orphanage could concentrate on the growth, those periods of years that the girls were in it. Because the one called the industry one, they taught them a trade so they could go out into the world and actually, work. I mean, women back then didn't always. They got married and they were expected to stay home. But Margaret knew. Margaret knew from her own experience that sometimes you have to be out there.
Well, these were orphans, and they had no family.
No, nothing,
girls, I mean, they lived with their families until they were married. These girls had no families. So they had to learn to do something for their keep. And St. Elizabeth's was known for its needlework. They taught the girls fine needlework. Many, a society bride would get her trousseau from St. Elizabeth's. They would order that because the workmanship, the craftsmanship was so fine. And so, once they finished at St. Elizabeth's, they could go out and they could find employment.
And one of the things that we've not really told our audience about that we're acutely aware of, but for folks watching, yellow fever was prevalent, especially here in the city, and that was critical to why we were having all these orphans. In today's world, we don't see orphanages because in the early 1900s, like 1902, 1905, they eradicated, they found out it was mosquito and then treated it. But prior to that, that is part of the reason that we had all of these orphans.
There were so many orphans, and they were living on the streets. They were abandoned on doorsteps, in cemeteries. It was an incredible problem, the likes of which we can't even comprehend. It really was. And so these orphanages were filled to overflowing, and especially in the 1853 yellow fever epidemic in New Orleans, where they can't even get a solid figure, but between 8,000 and 10,000 people died in that one epidemic.
So these orphans between these 3 facilities, and really that was Margaret's work, Sister Regis' work, and then at what point Sister Regis got sick and
Sister Regis died in 1862.
So
really, right when St. Vincent's was, had really just opened. She died, and but the Sisters of Charity and Margaret continued with that orphanage. And we were just talking about the 1853 yellow fever epidemic, and there are stories about Margaret during that epidemic and others, where she would go into these houses of yellow fever where almost entire families had perished, and try and do what she could do. And then in other houses, she would, the mother would be sick with the children. And she would tell the mother, I will take care of your children. Do not worry about that. And she would bring them back to the orphanage. That's the
I've read
kind
that.
of work that she did.
Yeah, even visiting the sick.
Yes. And, we're talking about the yellow fever epidemics, but an interesting aside to this, and this is way, years after Margaret died, but St. Vincent's in, the early 1900s, 1910, 1915, they were still having epidemics because, for example, the city would say, you need to take these orphans, and these orphans would be sick. These were young children sick, and the nuns would be like, we don't want to do this because we're exposing,
Others,
200 other children. And so there's one instance, they took them in, 6 or 7 young children. They infected all the other orphans with measles, and, some of those orphans died. So this
Right.
was going on, well into the 20th century.
Yeah, there were no vaccines back then for common childhood
No.
diseases, but when you're looking at it from the number of
Yes.
kids that are in these
Yes.
orphanages, that's why. So those were the 3 main ones with Margaret,
With
besides
Margaret,
the
but-
bakery as well, because she
Yes.
started getting sick.
Yes.
Around that time
But
frame.
over her lifetime, Margaret either built, supported,
Oh, yeah.
gave bread to 11
Yeah.
orphanages.
We talked
And-
about that
Yeah.
in our
So,
previous show.
Yeah.
Not all different denominations
Yes.
as well. for
Every
that.
race, color, and creed.
But
She-
her hands were in those 3. I mean,
Yes. Mm-hmm.
those were what she was mainly known for, and of course her bakery.
Uh-huh.
The bakery, she had a young man that stayed with her like a stepson, but she didn't
Yeah.
really leave him the bakery. But she would sit out in front of the bakery
Yes.
and greet people on the street as well that would come through, correct?
Yes, that's how, that's what people talk about when they talk about Margaret. And if you look at her statue, what's so telling about it is, and people started talking about having a statue in her honor the day after her funeral.
Right after. And the money started coming in then too.
And if you look at the actual statue, and the people that got together in this, they were adamant. They said, we don't want some stylized representation of Margaret. We want Margaret as we knew her, as we saw her every day. And so you will see Margaret, and she's sitting in a cane-back chair. And so you know that chair, she would bring it out, put it in the front of the bakery. People would come up to her, they would ask her for favors, ask the time of day to her, and, she was always available for that.
And I also heard that people would come for her advice on
Yes.
business and things like this
Yes.
because she was so successful in her endeavors for the orphans and for the
Yes.
nuns. And she was asked once, I think, too, Sister Regis said, why don't you become a nun and join us? And she said, I can't do my work
That's
if I did
right.
that.
That's
She had no
right.
desire to marry. She wanted to be there with them and with the children, but she felt like her work was with the business of providing for them.
That's right, exactly, yes. And provide she did.
We were just talking about the statue, and of course the statue the day after her death. But Margaret got sick.
Yes.
At the time, right around this time frame with these 3 institutions. She's getting older in life. She started with headaches, right? And just
Yes.
progressively, they really never knew what it was.
They never were able to diagnose it, and I think her death certificate, it might say something about maybe a cancer of the
Brain
brain
cancer,
or
yeah,
something like
that.
that, but they had no way of knowing. And so she spent time at Hotel Dieu, the hospital that was run by, I think, another order of the Sisters or Daughters of Charity. She spent time there, and while she was there, she had her will drawn up. And let me tell you about Margaret. The business people of New Orleans, and this is another aspect of her life that's so incredible for the times, because this just did not happen. The business people, the the social elite, as we would call them today, they flocked to Margaret. They gave her, the businessmen gave her advice, and these were the top businessmen in the city, you know, on you know, how to, you know, what to do with the money. And, you know, the women, they were just, you know, they were in awe of Margaret as well. So she was one of those people who every strata of society
Flocked to her.
yes, I mean, and here she is an illiterate Irish immigrant, no education, but can you imagine the kind of brain she had, you know, for that time? And, you know, being affiliated with the Sisters of Charity back then was very important because that gave Margaret cachet, it gave her credibility at a time when women were not out there at all. I
Right.
mean, you had very defined roles, and what Margaret did, that was not one of them. But they let her slide big time. They really did.
But she was a very successful businesswoman, too.
Yes.
But so they advised her on her will when she
Yes.
was dying. And she had quite a few visitors when they heard she was sick, too. I mean, it was nonstop
Yes.
visitation. And I've read even that a crucifix from the Pope
Yes.
was sent to her.
That's correct.
I mean, because of all the work she had done, Rome knew of her works here,
Yes,
which
I would
right there
love to know what
tells you-
happened to that crucifix. You know,
I don't
that's
know what
lost
Pope, but I
to-
mean, in
yeah,
that story.
I want to say the 10th, but I can't. You know, I'm not 100% sure. But I'd love to know what happened to that because, you know, what an artifact from, you know, from that time. Maybe it was buried with her.
It could have been. It could have
Yeah.
been.
And so, you know, when she was, so she made out her will while she was at Hotel Dieu because, you know, there was
She
an
knew it was
article
imminent, yeah,
about it.
she was getting sicker.
And she wanted to make sure that, you know, the orphanages were taken care of. And this brings us really to a whole separate part of the story because when Margaret died, when she was dying, she didn't die at Hotel Dieu. She was back at her apartment, which was somewhere in the three-story bakery. And what's so fascinating about that is that even back then, people knew that there was something so special about Margaret, because even in her lifetime, people called her a living saint. That they actually had, the Times-Picayune had a reporter stationed in a hotel close by to where she lived, and he was keeping watch.
Death watch.
Because
Yeah. To be the first.
yes, as soon as she died, to be the first with the story. And the reason that we know this today is because there was a story written about it from the actual reporter. He was remembering all the
Later,
stories he
yeah.
covered. And he especially talked about that and said that while he was keeping the watch, you know, some of Margaret's business, you know, the businessmen in the city would come up and they would tell him stories about Margaret while they were waiting for the end. And so when the end did come, which was February 9th, 1882, her body was embalmed and taken to St. Vincent's Asylum, to the chapel there where she was laid out, and the orphans and the nuns kept watch.
They did. And that reporter did report the story, and the Times-Picayune literally, all the businesses in town shut down when she died. The Picayune, her funeral literally was on the front page of the paper, boxed in black.
Yes.
You can pull it up on your genealogy sites to look at it.
Yes.
But
And it
was-
says Margaret. It
Yeah.
doesn't, you know, it's Margaret because that's what everybody knew her by.
Oh, yeah. And so he did get that story, and it did make the front page of the paper. You know, Anne, we just talked about when she died and what was in the newspaper, but she had a full state funeral,
Funeral.
unlike anyone else in the city. Some of the dignitaries and the people that were there, the archbishop presided, innumerable priests, Tell us about her
Yes,
funeral.
the pallbearers with the governor, the ex-governor, the mayor, General Beauregard, who
Was
was
there.
still alive. The top business, political, and social
Yeah,
people
who's
of
who
New
of New
Orleans.
Orleans were
Yes,
present.
absolutely. And her funeral was at St. Patrick's Cathedral, right downtown. And, they had a procession from the asylum, St. Vincent's Asylum, with the orphans from, probably 11
of
of
them,
those
yeah.
orphanages as part of the procession. Margaret was the patroness of a fire company. I think it was either the first or second Mississippi Fire Company, because back then you needed firemen. And so they kind of led the procession, and it wound its way through the Central Business District. And, people lined the streets, but what was really telling about it, and it was totally commented upon because apparently it was such a rare thing, either the Board of Trade or the Cotton Exchange, because that was where the business was conducted. The men all left their offices. They all trooped downstairs to the ground floor. They stood at attention, took their hats off in tribute to this woman who they all knew, they could never hold a candle to. So it was just, it was just such a feat and to do. And so, as we said previously, the next day, people started saying, we need a monument to Margaret. We will not let her go from us.
Yes. And for a long time, they thought that the monument that was here was the first woman, first monument to a woman in the United States, but it's actually the second.
It's the second.
But even so,
it's the first actually is to a woman named Hannah Dunstan up in New Hampshire, and who this is terrible, but it was. She killed some Indians that had killed her whole family, and so that was actually the first one. But you can always say Margaret was among the first. She was really the second, technically,
Right.
that we know of. But it was, it was a totally, you want to say it was spontaneous, but then it became organized because they were bound and determined
To do this.
to, hurry up and get this money. And the money, and this is very important, I think, because, I'm reading different versions of this now that, people, they change things. But truthfully, the money for this was raised pennies and nickels from the people of New Orleans. Some people gave larger gifts, but by and large, it was from the citizens of New Orleans. And I believe the marble statue was fashioned in Carrara, Italy, for about, I want to say $10,000. That was a lot of money back then. And the first, and this isn't widely known, but they brought the first statue here, and they kind of opened up the crate, and the people were like, "Oh no, this is not. This is not the representation we wanted." Shipped it back. Then they got the right one.
Oh.
Yeah. And if you notice, the one thing, as I said, they wanted Margaret represented as she was in life. A very plain, older Irish woman. And she has her arm around an orphan who, by the way, is a boy. And, but if you look at the pedestal that her statue is on, what you're going to see is the pedestal of a queen, because it was modeled after one of the pedestals from one of the queens of England. It's very ornate. So, the sculpture got that in too, but there's Margaret on top of it, plain as day.
you were telling me on break about a situation with St. Vincent's after Margaret had paid it all off, just out of curiosity.
Yes.
Tell me the rest of the story, because you did.
Well, you know, after Margaret died, she left bequests in her will for several of the orphanages, and also some of the money from the bakery, because it was going to continue to run for a little while. And so money from that would also go, especially to St. Vincent's. But when you get into like 1910, 1915, you find these stories, and there's a group called the St. Vincent's Sewing Circle. And these were Uptown Society ladies that grouped together. I don't know if they sat at St. Vincent's and sewed. I really doubt it. But what they did was, their primary purpose was to raise money for the orphanage, which had gone into debt. Again, Margaret was not there. They were deeply in debt, and so that was one of their primary purposes. And you know, that happened with a lot of the orphanages. After Margaret passed away, they could not keep up once her generosity was no more.
Well, her generosity may not have been there, but she's never died here in the city. I mean,
Yeah.
they still keep up the statue, but there are other things too. There is a man that opened a bar here, and his bar's named after him.
Danny O'Flaherty.
Right,
Yeah.
and he actually, he sings music and he travels and he performs. And he went back to Ireland, I know, because I think it was in 2015, it might have been 2016, where her house stands now. The country is trying to get her cause opened for canonization, to start her cause. And they actually had, I think it was August 15th, and I want to say it was 15, but it could have been 16 when I was reading on dates. He was there, and a bunch of other people from New Orleans were there as well, and they had a prayer service and music, and he wrote a song about her even.
Yes,
that's
it's
been
a
published.
beautiful
So
song.
there's been, you know, so much here.
Yeah, and actually,
alive.
Danny, through his pub, which was in the French Quarter, it closed after Katrina, like so many other businesses here. But you know, Danny, when he first came to New Orleans, being from Ireland, he wanted to learn about the Irish in New Orleans, and one of the first people he learned about was Margaret. He fell in love with her story, and he would talk about it in his, you know, the preamble to his songs, and he wrote this beautiful song about Margaret, and really reintroduced thousands of people to Margaret and her story. So, and even the ancient order of Hibernians here, there's a Margaret Haughery division, women's division. There's a Curragh Club, the Irish rowing boat, that's named after Margaret. So her legacy lives on. And to just give you an idea about how much it lives on, there was a story done, again, about 1910, 1915, where a reporter happened in on the Jewish orphan asylum, and he wrote about it. He said he was taken aback because there were the Jewish orphans, and they were praying the Kaddish, which is the morning prayer, for Margaret. And he's like, all these years later, Margaret had died in 1882. This is 1910, 1915. And they told him, you know, Margaret saved the orphans here. She brought us bread. She gave us money. We do not forget. And so they said that they honored Margaret every year with the Kaddish, and they would do so until the orphanage was there no more.
What an awesome story. And,
It is.
You know, folks were just about out of time, and I think that's a great ending point with, you know,
It is.
just how much she affected not
Yeah.
just Catholics and the people of New Orleans, but everybody. So, Anne, thank you so much for being on the show.
So welcome.
We've had a wonderful time learning about this absolutely saintly woman here in the city of New Orleans. And join us again, folks, for another episode of Roots of Faith.
I would have loved to know you, but that was long ago. I would have loved to talk to you, or maybe say hello, but your memory still lingers to this very day. love you, Margaret, in a very special way. Each time as I pass you by, I whisper soft your name. Those 1,000 little children, they must have felt the same. You're the angel of the Delta and the bread lady too. You gave your whole life, Margaret, to the orphans and the poor. I would have loved to know you, but that was long ago. I would have loved to talk to you, or maybe say hello, but your memory still lingers to this very day. We will always love you, Margaret, in a very special way. Your cart along the cobblestones, up the Channel Way, down to the old French market, making rounds of your dairy trade. In a calico sunbonnet, you wore a treasure shawl. Say, just call me Margaret, sure you didn't mind at all. I would have loved to know you, sing with me, but that was long ago. I would have loved to talk to you, or maybe say hello, but your memory still lingers to this very day. We will always love you, Margaret, in a very special way.